Those who assume hypotheses as first principles of their speculations may indeed form an ingenious romance. But a romance it will still be.
The Interplanetary Podcast. The exploration of space for the benefit of all mankind. Your hosts here in London, Matthew Russell and Jamie Franklin.
Oh, yeah, baby, Roger Coates.
Roger Coates, looking up in the sky, all the stars and the planets in front of your eyes.
That's a beautiful song. Have you been writing that for a while?
A few months now. I'm pretty happy with how it's turned out.
Jamie?
Yes.
Have you ever heard of Roger Coates?
Do you know what? I have. I've heard you mention him before, but I'm glad that we've got some more details here because turns out he was pretty special, right?
Very special and probably a tragic loss. Born today on 10th of July, 1682.
Yes.
But what he's famous for is being a mate of Isaac Newton.
Yeah, Big Isaac.
And of course, Principia has its own anniversary this week, I noticed.
And Roger was the man to proofread the second edition.
I think he did the preface as well, because he was the only person that really understood and could catch up with Newton's brain. He went over to Isaac Newton and said, look, Isaac, this book is insanely good. You need to revise it, though. We need to have a second edition. And he basically, Isaac Newton had sort of given up on science. He was sort of like, oh, yeah, whatever. I'm too busy doing alchemy. He's a total nut job, Newton, when you look at it.
Yeah.
But no, apparently Coates managed to coax Isaac Newton into being a scientist for the next 3.5 years, and they worked out things like the motion of the moon, the equinoxes, the orbits of comets, and obviously wrote arguably the most important space book ever written.
It's pretty important, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's pretty important. Yeah. And would you say, Matt, that I'm your Roger Coates?
I would think you are my Roger Coates.
Yeah, because you're a bit of a nut job, aren't you? And I'm sort of like trying to bring you down, make you put your work out.
Yeah, you're the only one that understands me, Jamie.
Yeah, this is it. This is it.
If it wasn't for you, I'd just be in the corner just doing Brian May covers.
which isn't so bad. I mean, that's
but
not such a bad lie.
You know, or arguing with people on Facebook.
Everything I do is driven by you.
I don't think I'm ever going to get round to covering that song.
Yeah, please don't cover that one. So should we talk about Rocket Lab fails?
Oh.
And I say fails, I mean that in the singular term because it's their first time.
Yeah, well, sort of. I mean, the very, very first flight of the Electron, of course, was a failure. But that's actually, not that uncommon for a maiden flight to go awry. But, this is the first failure with a commercial payload on board.
The name of the mission, I mean, for me, this is the best we've had so far.
Mm-hmm.
Pix or it didn't happen. I mean, that is awesome.
Well, but it did end up being a kind of a prophecy.
Yeah.
The moment that the video feed switched off, of course, that was the end of the mission, and we never really found out.
And it actually didn't happen. So, yeah, I believe it was Shakespeare, Matthew, who coined the phrase "hoist by their own petard." There we go.
Yeah. I'm sure there's probably about 6 Shakespeare phrases that you could apply to that particular moment in time. Electron has flown 13 times and 11 successes in a row since that maiden voyage. But this last 13th flight has, failed.
Oh, dear.
It had payloads from Spaceflight Inc., Canon Electronics Inc., Planet, of course, with their Super Dove things. But the depressing one, and I did mention this at the end of last week's podcast, where In Space Missions had a satellite on there from the UK called Faraday 1. And they were. I was actually following that story. It's the culmination of 2 years of extremely hard work and lots of money and getting money from various places. And, but not only is it just like a single satellite, but this satellite hosts lots of other satellites. So it hosts 7 payloads, and
Wow.
those payloads were from Airbus Defence and Space. So that was this Prometheus 1, the next generation of retaskable software-defined radios. Kleos Space with this maritime traffic tracking satellite. Lacuna Space, which is the Internet of Things. There was some Australian Environmental Research Centre. Cadensis Aerospace. Asterium, another major player. And worse payload to lose was a plaque inscribed with the mission logo from the families and school competition winners.
See,
And
that's sad. Yeah.
Yeah, that is quite sad, actually. And a secret gin recipe from the local distillery, Silent Pool Gin. So shout out to
Bloody-
Silent Pool Gin.
Shout
you didn't
out
quite make
to Silent
you didn't
Pool.
make it into space, but I've now heard of you, and hopefully our podcast listeners have heard of you, and we will all go out and buy your gin in commiseration.
Let's all go and buy some Silent Pool gin, please. And Silent Pool, if you're listening, I'm a big gin fan. If you'd like me to wear any t-shirts, I can put it up on our Instagram. I can maybe throw you a hashtag.
Yeah.
Yeah, love a gin. I won't tell anyone your secret recipe.
I'm assuming that they're a local to Borden in Hampshire, but I'm going to have to check that up. I've never really heard of the town Borden before, but
Well, I
there we
think
go.
maybe we should try and get an interview with somebody from Silent Pool. Our first, our first
Our
gin.
first booze interview.
Yeah. Matt, and you're a big fan of doing things. Do you remember ages ago we had that chat where I said I get annoyed that there's a part of me, a very small part of me, that, you know, if anything was like number 13 or, you know, walking over 3 drains that when you were a kid, people said it was bad
Avoiding
luck.
the crack.
Yeah,
avoiding the
just
cracks and
like, you know,
pain,
just avoiding it, just you know, just in case, you know, anything bad happened, which I know is ridiculous, but I do it sometimes anyway. But you actively seek out these things just to prove that it's BS. But yeah, 13th time. There we go. But you know what? It's just silly, really, isn't it? Because of course,
Yeah, do you know what? I didn't
things
even
on the
notice
13th
it.
time are going to fail. Yeah.
Yeah. There was a statement by Doug Liddell.
Yes.
It says, "In space will not be deterred by this unfortunate accident. A lot of amazing work has been achieved to date, and we are already putting our experience on Faraday 1 to work on our Faraday second generation ESA program, as well as our number of other satellites we've under contract. We are planning a Faraday 1B for launch in the middle of 2021, and we will now look to bring this forward. We will continue to work closely with our payload customers and plan to be on the launch pad again in the very near future."
Excellent and very wise words from Doug Liddell, CEO and founder of In Space Missions. Well, that's great, isn't it? And isn't that so space? It's just like, look, this has happened. It's not great, but we've learned from it. We're already on to the next thing. We're moving forward.
Quite a lot of stiff upper lip there. And of course, Peter Beck did a very, very quick video response that's worth watching. It's very good. Peter Beak. And it's great. Yeah. So,
Isn't there a
good.
band called Stiff Upper Lip?
I hope so.
Yeah,
If
I
not,
hope so. It's a great name, isn't it?
that should be actually a very good band name.
Matt, what's your favourite liner?
My favourite liner isn't eyeliner. It's Starliner.
Oh, OMG.
So who is getting redundancy? Is Boeing being made redundant, or is NASA seeking a redundant space system?
Yes.
It's actually the latter. So yes, in December we did have that rather awkward Starliner CST-100 flight that went completely wrong with a catalogue of hiccups. It turned out in the end. I mean, a software glitch that made the whole mission fail in its primary purpose. It wasn't a complete failure. It did manage to orbit and come back down, but there was 2 huge software errors. One where basically the Starliner had set its mission clock to the Atlas, and therefore thought it was in the wrong part of the mission, and it was just continually burning fuel to try and change direction. Then they found, when they were correcting that, they found another software glitch that could have ended the mission in potential disaster, and that was something to do with the way it disposed of the service module. But then it also turns out that the comms were really poor during the mission as well, that there's some kind of radio interference on the craft. So overall, compared to SpaceX's much more error-free trips to the International Space Station, it really was an embarrassment to both Boeing and really NASA. NASA have sort of reviewed their own procedures and found themselves a little bit wanting as well. So 80 recommendations have come out, and hopefully we'll see the Starliner go up on an Atlas V near the end of this year on a repeat of the mission, so almost a year later, and hopefully it will be flying in 2021.
Good Lord. Let's hope so.
Do you know when it was supposed to be flying? Do you know when Boeing said that they would get this thing flying by?
2015, wasn't it?
2015 originally, yeah. Then it was, properly chalked up for 2017, then 2018. I mean, we kept having it as this is the thing that's going to happen this year for 2018, 2019, and 2020.
But now we're a few years into the podcast. We're just used to it. We're cynical, We know that these things get predicted. We're very used to it. James Webb.
Yeah. Well, and just about everything else. Talking of that, I think old Bobby Zubrin, he's also fed up with space missions missing their deadlines, and he's pretty convinced that Artemis is not going to get to the moon by 2024. So he wrote a letter to NASA and the US government, basically with his plan to use Falcon Heavy and the Dragon capsules to do an Apollo 8 style mission where you fly around the moon, and just to sort of say, we can do this in the next year or so. Yeah. And it'll be a really good kind of, here we go, let's do it, kind of space thing to do and get everyone infused about space again. I absolutely loved when I sent it to the Discord. Rob's reply was the letter was essentially, "Dear Jim Bridenstine, here's an idea that will provide a further nail in the coffin of SLS. What do you think?"
It's so true. Yeah,
it was just like, yes, and he kind of points out that there's probably not much point to it, but maybe less pointless than launching a Tesla.
Yes.
So it's there's quite some interesting things in the Zubrin paper itself about, because a lot of people have been saying, the Dragon capsule just can't do a moon return. It's like, well, it's designed for Mars return, so the heat shield should be easily good enough. So, it's a good read anyway. So yes, if you get the chance, read Artemis 8 Using Dragon by Robert Zubrin. I'm going to give it a read. Yeah, nice one, Bobby. Always read worthy, isn't he, Bobby Z? I'll give him that.
He really is. Yeah.
Of course, the really big news this week, Jamie, and let's not dwell on it too much, but unlike any of our competitor podcasts, Jamie and myself have become co-owners of a mega constellation.
Oh, we don't want to brag about it.
We are now, Interplanetary podcasts are now actually officially commercial rivals to Elon Musk.
This is it. Yeah, I mean, he is going to be... He should be worried about us,
Co-owners of OneWeb, because the UK government, as we talked about last week, did indeed put in a bid with an Indian industrial company, a telecoms company, to take over OneWeb. And everyone is very unsure quite what the wisdom is. But there was a few little clues. They were saying that they might restrict other countries using it, which was like a whoa. Then they talked about manufacturing in the UK, but it's like, well, hang on a second. They've only just built the brand spanking new factory in America, so that doesn't quite make sense, especially if you're playing catch up with SpaceX. And of course, can they actually build GNSS, global navigation into it? Now that didn't get mentioned on the government press release. So the government was selling it much more in this is like a sort of sign to our commitment about UK space and being a world leader in digital technology. So that's at the moment where it stands. So we just don't know, Jamie. I'm willing to be positive about the whole thing. And of course, it does give us bragging rights over pretty much every other podcast.
Exactly. Eat that, other podcasts.
In your face.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of me that's hoping, of course, that they won't have the last laugh on this one.
Yeah, I think we're going to regret this.
Well, I don't know. I really don't know. I just don't know. In astronomy, if you've been looking out your window in the very early morning, you can perhaps see Comet Neowise just before the sun rises. It's become a visible naked eye comet, and there's been some fantastic pictures of it. Just straight camera pictures of Comet Neowise. So that's definitely worth going out. It might be sort of fading now, but it's definitely worth trying to have you have to get up early, just before sunrise, basically, and you should be able to see it where the sun is about to rise. If you look off in that direction, you should be able to see it coming up.
I need to get involved. The weather's been a bit dank recently, but I'll have a look.
Well, exactly. Well, I was going to do it, but it never kind of actually happened. Another one that's come up. Some European officials have started talking openly about Ariane 7, let alone Ariane 6.
Oh.
And they've been saying essentially that it needs to be reusable, as SpaceX have redefined the whole business.
Yeah, well, that's true.
But Ariane 6 itself is a needed stepping stone to get to Ariane 7. So we'll have Ariane 6 for a bit, but then, yes, we will probably next see an Ariane spacecraft after that, the designs having little landing legs just like the Falcon 9. So that should be interesting.
Bound to happen.
Yeah,
they got some catching up to do, as you said.
That is severe catching up right there. Talking of catching up, there's been a delay with the Mars Perseverance rover because of a problem with the Atlas V Centaur stage, apparently. So it's been a bit of a delay. So obviously that pushes a little back on the launch window. And if you miss it, you have to wait 2 years. And of course, that's already happened to the European rover twice. So it's not all certain for Perseverance. I'm pretty certain it will still go, but it's just a little bit more dicey than it was in the previous week.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dice did flow.
Exactly. So, Jamie, do you want to get on to our little science story of the week? Well, it's not really a science story. It's actually me being destroyed with facts and logic.
Here we go.
So yes, there was a paper. Again, this came out on the on the Discord channel. Our patrons shared this one. Human-assisted science at Venus exploration in the new human spaceflight age.
That's my kind of
exciting.
title.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a white paper for the Planetary Science and Astrobiology Decadal Survey 2023 to 2032 by Noam R. Eisenberg at Johns Hopkins University et al. Right? Now, it explicitly debunks something that I said in podcast 183. And podcast 183
brilliant.
Was our live show from the Space Store.
Oh, yeah.
Now,
what a great day. Shout out to the Space Store in Oxford.
Absolute shout out to the Space Store. But the one thing I did do was quite a bit of research for like the journey to Mars. And the first part I got to was the choice between an opposition versus conjunction flight. Now, what I said at the time, so opposition, fly from Earth and you land on Mars 180 days later, right?
Yes.
But you leave Mars 30 days after that. So it's like, I've got to go because I've got to go now to fly and do a Venus flyby to get back to Earth on day 640.
Okay.
So that's a long old flight, the Mars, Venus, Earth flight. Now, the conjunction version is exactly the same. You fly to Mars, 180 days, you get there, you stay on Mars for 1.5 years, because that you have to wait until you get this launch window again that allows you to get back to Earth. And so you fly back to Earth, and it takes another 180 days, because it's kind of like the reverse journey that you did before. So that mission is 270 days longer. And the reason why I was pointing that out was because basically it's a 1,000-day mission. So it's pretty much 3 years, over 3 years to sort of be on. It's a long one. So it's a sort of 3-year mission, whereas your opposition mission is really just over 2 years. So there is a difference, but I said at the time that when you looked at the propulsion required to do the opposition version, it required a lot more fuel, a lot more delta V. So for every 100% increase in delta V, you have 400% increase in propellant mass. So it's one of those horrible equations. It only has to be a little bit out and you're in trouble. And the argument I made was that pretty much it would definitely be a conjunction mission. Therefore, people would be out for 3 years. Now, it turns out what I hadn't seen, Jim Bridenstine had given his talk, a keynote speech, where he actually talks about the fact that NASA really were considering the opposition class mission.
Okay.
Which is where they go to Mars via and come back via Venus as a 2-year mission. And it was like, oh my God. So actually NASA have really kind of turned their back on the papers that I was using and have come back to this thing of, no, it would almost certainly be this opposition style thing. And this paper talks about what a great idea that is. So that they talk about this, that Bridenstine's already said it, and that a recently released paper called The Sustained Lunar Exploration and Development, a NASA paper, had confirmed that it was a 2-year round-trip mission to Mars that they were planning. In other words, it can't be this conjunction. It must be the opposition class mission that they're planning. It implies that, even though it doesn't explicitly say it. But what it's saying, but this paper is saying what a great idea a Venus flyby mission is, because there's so many pluses. Although the clear big negative is that you have to spend a long time on a spacecraft, over a year. Whereas before you only had to spend 180 days and most of your time on Mars. So it's like, but then saying that is a 2-year journey, but there's some other benefits to it. So obviously the great thing is you spend all this money and you actually get 2 planets for the price of one. You get to go to visit Venus. Now, although you're not landing on Venus, which arguably is a terrible idea.
Definitely don't do that, no.
They could actually spend some time as they approach Venus. If you want to teleoperate something, i.e. using remote control.
Yeah, do some science.
For about 2 days, you've got a window as you fly past Venus of pretty much instantaneous control of objects. So,
Cloud
for
City.
example, you could get astronauts to control rovers. You could get astronauts to control the descent vehicle. You could get astronauts to control aerial platforms. Yeah, like you said, like some like drones in the atmosphere.
Well, it's definitely where I imagine Lando Calrissian living.
Yeah, exactly. So that I think they will accidentally bump into a cloud city and go, oh my God, there is life on Venus, which would probably change everything. If intelligent people were living in clouds in Venus, that would be definitely newsworthy.
Almost certainly going to happen.
Yeah. And so, but the advantage, of course, is that crew can react very, very quickly to the information they're seeing. So they'll see something, then they can fly to it or move the rover to it. And it needs to be done quickly because, of course, stuff on Venus doesn't last very long when it's under insane pressure, acidic rain, and ridiculously high temperatures. So it's a good thing. So you could actually get like some proper good science done. And of course, the kind of mass of your vehicle is so big anyway because you're going to Mars and there's a lot of stuff on it. This kind of additional mass for science payloads for Venus actually isn't that bigger a deal, because as a
Agreed.
percentage of your of the overall mission architecture, it's not actually that bad. And of course, they may even be able to do a sample return as well. So the crew could fly a sort of atmospheric scoop and then guide it back to the spacecraft, and that would actually be easier to do than a completely robotic mission.
I was just going to say, I think you're spitting straight facts at the moment.
Yeah, well, exactly.
You know,
It could also be that that you could use this Earth, Venus, Earth, because the great thing about flying past Venus on the way to Mars or on the way back is that you've got this mission abort opportunity, but you've also got you could do the Apollo 8 version of at least doing a pretty decent shakedown of your spacecraft by doing a swing by Venus and coming back. In other words, it's only a year-long mission. I say only a year-long mission, but Scott Kelly was on the International Space Station for a year, so it's like at least it's within the realms of stuff that we've done before. Although actually going to Venus is actually higher radiation than going to Mars, because obviously you're nearer the sun. But
yes,
but actually it does protect you a little bit from the sun. Actually protects you from the radiation coming in from outer space, from outer galactic, outer solar system stuff firing in, which is actually probably higher energy and more dangerous anyway.
Who'd have thought it? The sun protecting us from radiation.
Well, yeah. So it does actually, it gives you that opportunity. And of course, there's lots of things in there that are quite interesting, like latency. So, for example, when you're on your way to Mars, that your comms latency varies from 6.4 minutes to have a conversation to 44 minutes. All right, Jamie. 44 minutes later. All right, Matt. It's like
44 minutes later. Pardon?
What? Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Oh, God.
Particularly if you're in a Starliner. Sorry, what did you say?
It would be a very different podcast, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it'd be very annoying. So, the Venus is only 4.6 minutes to 28 minutes, so it's a little bit easier to deal with. So, at least it would give you practice at that longer latency time without being really annoying. Well, I mean, it's still really annoying, but it's a good practice thing. Again, in some ways, what we're talking about is this Venus flyby being very similar to going to the moon before going to Mars, sort of treat it like a staging post. But also, Venus would give the astronauts an opportunity to do some science midway through a journey. So, like, boredom and everything else is one of the mind killers, one of the most dangerous things on a long, isolated space flight. Boredom is a disaster.
Not good for the health.
Not good for the health. So having this really exciting and very intense mission halfway through, which they can plan for and all that kind of stuff, and get ready for and
get the science experiments ready.
Get the science, and it's like they know that they're doing something really, really, really worthwhile.
Do you know what it was like, Matt? It was like when we, as kids, our parents would drive us to Dorset to go on holiday. Shout out to Lyme Regis. And halfway, we would always stop and go to the Little Chef. And I would always get toasted tea cakes. And then on the way out, I'd get given a free lollipop. So it's kind of exactly the same as what you're saying.
It's absolutely the same. You were doing a
4-hour drive, and so 2 hours in, I knew that we were going to stop.
So Venus is your little chef, isn't it?
Literally, it's the same thing. Yeah,
it is absolutely.
I wonder if you get
thing.
a free lollipop when you leave the orbit of Venus.
Well, you might come away free in the knowledge that you've furthered human knowledge. You know, because the whole idea of Venus, Earth and Mars, really, the big question is, why are Venus, Earth and Mars so different? Where did our histories converge or diverge? Why did it all go wrong for Venus in a spectacular way that like it has, and why did it go wrong for Mars in the spectacular way that it has in the opposite direction? Why is it brilliant for us on Earth? These are pretty important questions.
They're
And if you
hugely
can,
important.
and if you can answer more of those questions by spending a similar sort of money, then the Venus flyby does seem to be a very smart move. It's just this very, very long space journey. But get this, if the space that your exposure to radiation, which as we've discussed quite a lot of times, is one of the biggest concerns for this opposition class mission, it's actually you get slightly less radiation than you would on the longer 3-year mission, even though obviously your radiation exposure goes up a little bit because you're flying towards Venus and you're out in the spacecraft for a long time. They think that even then it would just be less exposure than the longer 3-year mission. So that's interesting. So there does seem to be a lot of evidence here that I'm completely won over by this paper, by the way, and I love their finding at the end. It says, finding human to Mars via Venus is logical, exciting, and offers unprecedented science at Mars and Venus at a fraction of a cost of dedicated crew missions to both.
I love that.
Yeah, Venus is how we get to Mars.
Boom.
So now we can have a Trump tweet that says we should be talking about the marvelous Venus, which of course is part of Mars.
I've always said Venus is the place we should be.
It's a beautiful planet. Jamie, I've got an interview to play you.
Oh, finally.
I did it this time last week with
Who have we got?
our good friend Gurbir Singh, who has a book out about, well, I'll let him explain. It's about an Indian legend, but as we know, Gurbir is a really an Indian space expert, but he's written about all sorts of things, space related and British space and Yuri Gagarin and all those kind of things. And he lives in sunny Manchester. He's got his own podcast as well. So actually, he's like us. He's a podcast that owns a space network, which is,
He definitely is. And although he writes about legends, the irony is, Matt, that he is a legend.
He really is. astrotalk.uk.org is his website. Awesome place to go. Lots of stuff. He's written some great books. But yes, his new book, India's Forgotten Rocket Pioneer, Stephen H. Smith.
Excellent. Let's roll it.
The Interplanetary Podcast, putting the ace back into space.
So I am joined on the podcast yet again by Gurbir Singh. Welcome back to the podcast. How are you up in sunny Manchester?
It is indeed sunny now that we're on audio only. I think I can say that safely. I'm very well. How are you, Matthew?
I'm good. I'm just working hard and keeping my head down. That's that's how I roll these days. So the reason why we've got a call is because you've got yet another book out. So first things first. Tell us about the book and the background and everything about it. Because I think we heard a little bit of the story about the book on the last podcast, but refresh our memory.
Yeah. So this book is called India's Forgotten Rocket Pioneer, and it's a story about a guy who's called Stephen Smith, and I will come back to that name. He is Indian. He was doing his rocket pioneering work in India. But I wrote about him in a chapter in my first book, The Indian Space Program, which is what we spoke about when we last spoke. And it's a story about an individual that a lot of people around in India, as well as outside the world beyond, don't really know much about him. So this is this big gap in the development of rockets when it comes to India. And that gap is, historically, rockets were, you've heard of Congreve rockets. those Congreve rockets were based on rockets that were used by a guy called Tipu Sultan, who was trying to protect his kingdom of Mysore against the British at the time. But when he was defeated, those rockets came into England, and on the back of the Industrial Revolution and the technology developments that were taking place here, those rockets were developed, and Britain used them in Europe against France and Denmark, and even against the Americans in the USA. So this tradition of development of rockets in India appears to have stopped then, and started again when the Indian Space Research Organization kicked off, or in the early days it was known as INCOSPAR, which launched its very first rocket in 1963. So between 1799, days of Tipu Sultan, and 1963, the rise of the now Indian space program, there was this big gap. And Stephen H. Smith was a guy who was testing rockets in India, in Calcutta mostly, between 1930s and 1940s. In all, he did about 270 rocket experiments. And in this nearly 10 years of doing rocket experiments, he was the only one who was doing it for that long. And he developed various types of rockets, what he called boomerang rockets, telescopic rockets, and near the end of his 10 years, he even experimented with multi-stage rockets. And this is a time, 1930s and 1940s, when you will know that the British Interplanetary Society was founded. The rocketry societies were founded right around the world, not just here in Britain, but in Germany, in Austria, in America. And one of the earliest practical ways of testing rockets was one of the things that really took off was to send mail using rockets. Now, this wasn't in any practical sense trying to replace the post office, but it was very experimental, and also it allowed the people who were doing the development of rockets to generate some income from the vast philatelic community who were really into collecting all types of flown mail. And there were individuals like Friedrich Schmiedel in Austria, and Gerhard Zucker in Germany, and even Karel Roberti in the Netherlands. All of these individuals were funding their rocketry development by flying basic mail and then selling it to collectors. And the other two ways that some rocketry experimenters generated income to allow them to continue with these experiments was to test what was happening in the high altitude. And particularly Friedrich Schmiedel in Austria was one guy who was probably technically the most competent individual who was doing that in Austria. He had the technical training and individuals who provided him with the know-how, and he, unfortunately, I think he's one of the individuals who doesn't carry through to the modern era as a real the recognition of his work is not doesn't really compare with what he really did in his time. But Stephen Smith, as well as testing rockets using rocket mail, he also, and this is one of the other contributions of Smith's work, was that he tested rockets in the delivery of food and medicines and even living creatures. And that's something that nobody else had done. And then finally, just want to mention that although Stephen Smith did all his work in India, he was probably the very first member to join the BIS from India. BIS was founded in 1933. The first rocketry experiments were conducted in Britain by Gerhard Zucker, a German, And it was that motivated, Stephen Smith says, him into doing those rocketry experiments in India. And so the work that Stephen Smith was doing was something that was carried in the press in India. It got international recognition around Europe and US. And it also appeared in the bulletins of the BIS way back in 1933. And at that time, the editor of the BIS was a guy called Arthur C. Clarke. So he has a lot of international connections, and I think that's what one of the main key contribution of this book is. It's to highlight the work he did and his international contacts. A lot of that work, a lot of that details of that work has really been hidden in detail. And one more finally, this book wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't been able to trace the work of, or rather the archive of a 25-year-long correspondence. And it was a correspondence between Stephen Smith and Dr. Robert Paganini. Paganini was a Swiss philatelist who'd started the Philatelic Society in Switzerland way back in 1912. And although Smith got to know Paganini by inviting him to be an honorary member of the Indian Airmail Society that Smith had set up in Calcutta, they did get into a correspondence starting in 1925, which lasted till about 1950, about quarter of a century. And that's the year that Paganini died. And sadly, although there were very close relationships and they never actually met, it's a testimony to how long and deep and sincere the relationship these two guys had, that when Paganini died, he left him a quarter of everything in his will to Smith. And sadly, Smith died just a few months later in February 1951.
Crikey. Well, that is, what an absolutely extraordinary relationship that is. So I'm still struggling to work out how you use a rocket to deliver mail on a commercial basis. Was it actually working as a commercial thing, or was it just the hope that it might do?
No, it never made it to commercial status, really. There was a proposal from the US. In fact, in 1959, the Americans tested what they would call missile mail. And there was actually a cruise, believe it or not, a cruise missile that was used in the delivery of mail, just to demonstrate that it could be done. Now, this is 1951, 1959, long after most of the early rocket mail pioneers had done their work. And a mail missile was used to deliver mail. It was launched from a submarine, believe it or not. Right. And it was automated, of course, unmanned, uncrewed, and it had a formal recognition where the Postmaster General of the US, they had all these dignitaries and signed copies of the mails, and indeed one letter was presented to President Eisenhower in the middle of 1959. And the conclusion of that experiment was to demonstrate that missiles could be used, and they would reduce the delivery time by a huge factor. But of course, by that time, aeroplanes were much more reliable and cheaper. They could carry passengers and mail, and they could be traveling long distances anyway. And that model of air mail by rockets and missiles really fell way back, and was never made any headway.
It's just, it's just a moment of history that I just, until I talked to you the first time, I'd never ever even considered it a thing. So back to Smith's rockets, you said he had lots and lots of different designs. Presumably, his goal wasn't to make mail rockets, but his goal was actually to To do what? Well, to launch rockets into space, or do you know whether he talked about that at all?
He personally himself never mentioned space, although papers published afterwards, after his death, do talk about the ability of using his rockets as a starting point to get into space. And indeed, one correspondent, and I found this letter in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. He said, "Oh yes, this guy in India was well ahead of the Russians." This is published in the early 60s, and it makes the highlights the note, highlights the point that Smith, during his lifetime, conducted 3 experiments which carried living creatures. There was a snake, a mouse, and chicks, small couple of chicks that were transported in one of his rockets. And this piece that was published in the early 60s compared Smith's efforts in transporting living creatures using rockets with that of Laika and Sputnik, and commented that at least Smith's rockets carried these animals and the animals survived, whereas Laika didn't, which I thought was a bit cheeky compared to what the Russians were doing. But nevertheless, what Smith was trying to do, and I find just go back to his early days. So he was 11 in 1903 when the very first aeroplanes took to the sky, and he was 18 in 1911 when the very first airmail took place, and it took place in India. So the very first official airmail transport took place in India in 1911, and it was relatively close to where Smith was just about finishing school in northern India. And I'm guessing that both of those events, the idea of, when you're 11 and you hear about flying machines, it must be a bit like what I remember when I was 11 about Apollo 11 landing on the moon. It's just sort of so inspiring. And likewise, when he was leaving school, he must have heard about this record-breaking event in India, not far from where he was, and perhaps that inspired him to follow the idea of this new revolutionary method of transport. I suspect, and I'll talk about his family in a moment, but I suspect he would have liked to have gone into aviation, maybe fly, or even learn to fly and own a plane, but that didn't happen for him. So the idea of something even newer, of rockets, was something which he could engage in. If I just mention that his rockets were all initially all solid fuel rockets. The solid fuel that he was using, he purchased from providers commercially, from companies that were available producing these things for commercial operations. There was the Orient Fireworks Company and James Payne and Sons. These are British companies, but this is time of British India, so they had a presence in India. And because Smith is based in Calcutta, although Calcutta was originally the capital of India until 1931, a lot of the big contacts and big investments and the big names in terms of individuals were still based in Calcutta, and Calcutta Airport was pretty much a gateway for the British Empire, particularly en route from Britain to Australia. So there was a lot of intense activity, and he had a lot of contacts. So he was able to purchase the solid fuel from off the shelf, so to speak. Later on in life, about 1944, he talks about using compressed air and gas as propellant, although there's very little detail of which gas and how he was getting the compressed air for his rockets. But he was making use of these rockets to transport what he thought was useful in India, particularly in India, where you have very little infrastructure, or in some parts of India where you had very little infrastructure in terms of roads and rails. And it's a vast landscape, land mass is huge as India. He was trying to demonstrate that you could use rockets as much cheaper, much more efficient to cover much larger distances, and specifically distances which weren't otherwise covered by rail or road. And he went on 2 occasions. He went to a place called Sikkim, which was then separate, but still part of the British India, a protectorate of British protectorate, as separate. But now today, Sikkim is a state of India, so it's India. But he got permission to go there. He wrote to the king of Sikkim, and he got permission, and he showed that in the undulating landscape of Sikkim, which is in the foothills of the Himalayas, rockets could be used, particularly at a time of emergency. And there was an earthquake in 1934, not in Sikkim, but in the other side of India, now in Pakistan, in Quetta, which demonstrated that rockets could be used as an emergency transport vehicle. And he demonstrated this in very small quantities of food and medicine to show that it was a reliable solution under these circumstances. So he was trying to solve a practical problem, but he really didn't have a great deal of personal skill in terms of technology or technical skills. And he was just developing his skills as he went through. And just one last point about his family. So I mentioned his name is Stephen Smith, and you say, what, Stephen Smith, Indian? Well, his father was from England. His father was from Lincolnshire, in a town called Brigg, which is not far from Scunthorpe. And he went out in the 1960s as a tea plantation manager. And his mother must have been of mixed heritage. And if you look at Stephen Smith, he's pictures of him it's always very difficult to tell from black and white pictures, but I suspect he was brown-skinned, Indian in appearance, black hair, but he wrote terrific English, and he spoke, I'm sure, very good English, as well as Hindi, no doubt. So he thought of himself, he's from this complicated background, and the only time where I see him writing about his nationality is way back, after independence, when India is an independent nation, and he writes to the then Indian Prime Minister Nehru, and in that letter he asserts himself to be an Indian, saying that he's born in India, he is an Indian, but he was, he's called Stephen Smith, he was a Christian, his father was British, and indeed, he had a son who, in the late 60s, left India and came to London, and even today, or at least when I last communicated with him, his daughter and great-granddaughter live in London, in part of Walthamstow in London, but they've really lost all that connection with their great-grandfather and all the work that he did in rocketry.
That's mad, isn't it? What a crazy story. I mean, as he was learning, as he was going, was there any specifics in terms of the rocket technology that he developed that perhaps found its way around the world? That, you know, if he's writing things for the BIS and other people are aware of his work, were there innovations that he actually sort of had come up with that sort of found their way into other institutions?
I've not found any evidence of anything specific. What I did find is that he was doing this work at that key time in history. And in fact, one of the letters that I found, this was from April 1936. There's a letter from the BIS, founder of the BIS, Phil Cleater, who's writing a letter to Edward Pendray, the founder of the then American rocketry, initially it was called the American Interplanetary Society, then later changed its name to the American Rocketry Society. So this letter, dated April 1936, Cleater is talking about passing on information from Smith's experiment from India, because Smith, at least by that time, he was a member of the BIS. And he's writing this letter to Edward Pendray, and he says to Pendray, "Oh, can you then send me some details of what Goddard is doing?" So in the early 30s, you'll remember all the names like Werner von Braun, Hermann Oberth, and Robert Goddard. He's a contemporary of their time, and his contribution was nowhere near. But what I have found that, and I think this is where the book makes a contribution, is that Smith had this incredibly wide, broad range of contacts internationally. And the fact that I found files on his work in the Smithsonian, in Switzerland, in the Museum of Communication there, in the British Interplanetary Society have records of him, and particularly the vice president of the BIS in the 1930s was a guy called Leslie Johnson in Liverpool. And I was able to see that file that his daughter still has, and that formed part of the contribution in the book. And I also went down to places like the London Postal Museum. And indeed, when I was in India doing the research for the Indian Space Program book, I went to Sikkim. The capital of Sikkim is Gangtok. And in the Gangtok archives, I found a file that the king of Sikkim had, because he corresponded with him, getting his permission to come to Sikkim to do his tests. And in addition to that, I found records of references to his work, as well as in these letters exchanges between Phil Cleater and Edward Pendray. There are letters between Schmiedel and also in publications, official publications within some of the NASA conferences where his name is mentioned. So it's surprising that so few people know about him, and I'm hoping that some of this detail in this book will bring his work out of the shadows.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So have you got a lot of interest in, say, places like in India itself about this book? Presumably this would be a lovely story for particularly people working for the ISRO and places like that, where it's like, yeah, we've actually got this heritage that we didn't really know about. Have you had a lot of interest like that?
Well, when I was doing the research for the Indian Space Program book, I did ask a lot of the people I was interviewing for that book if they'd ever heard of Stephen Smith, and all of them said no. So when I did get the initial ideas for this book, and particularly the Paganini archive, I then contacted a former ISRO chairman, Kiran Kumar, and I told him about this, and I asked him if he would be interested in writing a foreword to the book, which he agreed, and that foreword is in there. So I think there is a general interest, particularly within the, if you like, the modern community of India, which has an interest in space, even though the work that Smith did fell way short of anything that you might call related to anything in the way of space. But yes, there is an interest, because I think one of the key reasons, I think, why Smith's work has been stepped over in history is because he was not really a well-known individual, although his name is well-known and he had all the international contacts. In India, He wasn't very well known. And then he had this thing called the Second World War. And then during that period, he started not to publish as much as he used to before the war started. And then, of course, he was living in Calcutta. Not many people appreciate that, although India, mainland India, was spared any direct action, but Calcutta docks was bombed by the Japanese Air Force. So he would have been in earshot of that. He would have heard about it. So they had this tumultuous period of the Second World War. There was a famine in India, particularly in Bengal, in the part of India where he was. And then after the war, as with any world war, this huge shifts of people. So the big communities of the Americans who were based there during the war, they left. The British, of course, as part of the independence that came 2 years later in 1947, they left. There was a lot of very strong Jewish community in Calcutta, and at the foundation of Israel at the same time, a lot of the Jewish community left. So it became a very traumatic period to be living through. And Smith writes about having the privations, in the UK, there was the rationing still a few years after the war. Life was tough. Services went back to normal as when the war ended. It took quite a few years. And in India, there was this additional overhaul of a new government coming in. And he describes, and I remember reading one of the letters where he describes some of the rioting that took place as part of the independence and the separation of India and Pakistan that took place. Really vivid and scary examples of some of the things that he experienced. And alongside all of this, he himself, no doubt part of the reason was that there was limited access to food and resources. He spent most of 1947 onwards till the end of his life being ill. And in one case, he talks about, he says he should have died. But he did survive, and I think that period, that tumultuous period that followed after the war and the last 5-7 years of his life, he was overrun by world events. So a lot of his work just fell in the shadows of history.
Well, that's what a pity. When does the book actually come out?
It's already out. It's out in all good bookstores. It's available in paperback, hardback, and then of course ebook versions as well.
Talking about the Indian space program more generally, obviously the sort of big news at the moment is it's been reasonably hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. So, have you got any kind of further news or elements that you've heard about what's happening over in India? Or are there kind of major, because they've got some really exciting missions coming up over the next few years. Have those big missions had any kind of major setbacks that you've heard?
I think all of the major programs have had a setback, although I did see an announcement from a government minister saying that the major mission, the Gaganyaan, the human spaceflight mission, was still on target with a launch date in 2022. It's still at very early stages. If I just bring you up to speed where I think we are with the Gaganyaan mission. So this was a mission that was announced by the Prime Minister of India in 2017 with the idea of having 2 or 3 Indian astronauts in low Earth orbit, which were launched from India on board an Indian launch vehicle for about a week-long mission. A lot of the basic technologies have been tested already, a bit like the crew escape system. They've been developing the human capsule for some time. 4 astronauts have been identified and they're undergoing astronaut training in Russia. Although there was a bit of a hiccup earlier on the year, as soon as the lockdown started, but I understand they've now resumed their training in Star City in Moscow. The announcement stated that India will continue with testing of the launch vehicle, particularly some more in-flight abort testing this year. So far, as I'm aware, they haven't taken place. They want to do about 3 or 4 flight abort tests. The announcement only 2 days ago that from the government minister saying that, yep, we're on target for the 22 timeline. Now that's subject to at least 2 uncrewed orbital flight tests, but those uncrewed flight tests, were scheduled perhaps one the end of this year and one next year, prior to the actual flight test with a crew of 3. That hasn't happened. It's as all governments do, they make all the right noises. They could be right; it could still happen, but the COVID lockdown has seen delays right around the world. As you know, the European Space Agency and Russia spacecraft to Mars has gone off the shelf and delayed by about 2 years. So the human spaceflight program is ongoing, and the target for 22 is still there. The other programs that India had for flights to Venus or Venus orbiter, there is a mission called Aditya, which has been in the pipeline for a very long time. That was planned to be launched later this year or early next year. That also currently doesn't have a fixed date for launch. That's a solar mission to investigate the sun. And India is also interested in going back to Mars, another Martian orbiter mission. But those are pretty much on hold. It's unclear. But one thing I can tell you about, and again, this is something new, the private space sector in India isn't huge, but there are many space startups based in India which are looking forward to something that in India is called the Space Activities Bill, which is essentially Indian legislation, which would allow Indian space companies to operate within the space sector. That bill hasn't come through. That I really think is the really important next hurdle before this private space sector can take off. But in the Indian Space Research Organization, following a public meeting, a meeting that was publicized, which was headed by the Prime Minister, said to ISRO that you have to open up your resources. So the various sites that ISRO has for launching spacecraft, testing spacecraft, building them, will be made available to private space sector companies. And ISRO, I think, is now going to do that. It's been forced to do that. And once the bill comes into play, there will be, hopefully, there's really good positive signs. First time I've seen those, that the private sector in India can actually take a step forward, and who knows what will happen once that starts.
Yeah, I think that's that's a really exciting news story. It's one that we did actually spot a couple of weeks ago coming down the lines about that the ISRO were being told that they had to share their facilities. I think that's a really exciting one, isn't it? I think commercial space all around the world is a exciting prospect that's becoming more and more a thing, isn't it? Really.
Mm.
Oh, we could go forever. Actually, I was just about to ask you a question that would open up a can of worms about the Indian human space flight and the desire for that, and whether that's actually taking away from their perhaps more noble scientific aims but yeah, well, have you got a quick answer to that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, I very quick. I think it's, a bit like you and perhaps everybody listening. I'm a fan of space, and I would like to see India launching its human spaceflight program. But I think it's so expensive compared to what else you could do with the same money in space. I would rather India put that on hold and spend more time doing their science exploration missions. But that's where we are, and I think a lot of this is being driven by what China is doing, and China's taking some major leap forwards, and it's driving India to keep up, and this is one of the consequences of that. If I can just mention, going back to, in conclusion, back to Stephen Smith, one thing I didn't mention is that you will be familiar, because of the British Interplanetary Society's history, that the BIS was involved in founding of the International Aeronautical Federation, which is responsible for the annual International Aeronautical Conference, IAC, that happens every year. And that first meeting that took place in France, in Paris, in 1950, where the BIS was present, it was one of the founding members, is Friedrich Schmiedel, incidentally, one of these rocket mail pioneers, was present at that meeting. This happened in 1950. It's a pity that Stephen Smith wasn't recognized then, and of course he was probably too ill at that time anyway. But if through India, if Stephen Smith could have possibly been recognized, what he was doing in India, could have had a presence in Paris in 1950. Perhaps India also could have had an interplanetary society. And I'm just wondering, speculating of the impact of of what that could have meant in terms of propelling and accelerating the space activities in India, starting back in the 1950s. As it was not the case, and Stephen Smith really did not have the kind of recognition then, and the opportunity was lost. And it's interesting, the same difficulties that he suffered, that Stephen Smith didn't get the recognition from the government, is exactly the same cycle that the Indian space startups have been going through. And hopefully this recent announcement will open that up, and there will be indeed some more space activities coming out of India as the private space sector opens up.
I suppose that the human spaceflight thing, if India are able to do a human spaceflight in 22 or even 23 or even 24, that will put them only the fourth nation ever to achieve it. So that's an astounding achievement in itself, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and I'm just mindful of the huge cost of this, and it is a terrific achievement, and I would love to see that happen. But especially the current situation, economies around the world are taking a hit, and I'm sure India will too. Will find that it needs to recover the losses over the last few months, and that economic recovery will play an important role in how fast and how quickly the space sector, space activities in India can recover by too.
In some ways, the space sector is a really good vehicle for spending your way out of recessions, isn't it? In a way, I kind of see it as because you're opening up a new frontier that potentially has opens up a new economy. So I can see that the space sector at the end of all this could go either way, couldn't it? It could suddenly have an enormous cut in spending, or face something quite opposite, where everyone's going, well, we need to inject some cash and some money into something that is exciting and reinvigorates the whole world. I think space is well placed for that.
Yes, and particularly as you see the rise of the private space sector around the world. Even China has about 30 odd companies that are considered to be private sector companies. And of course, we know what SpaceX has been doing in leaps and bounds over the last few years. And all of that, I think, is quite encouraging and hopeful and optimistic view of the coming few years.
Well, yeah, I shall be ordering myself a copy of the book on a good bookstore, probably Amazon. Ironically, a little bit of that money will go towards building rockets.
The Interplanetary podcast is alive!
There we go. Awesome as always.
So good. Matt, if people want to know a bit more, where should they go?
They should go to www.astrotalkuk.org. That's for Gurbir. For us, though, Jamie, where should people go if they wanted to join our lovely patrons, who this show would not be possible without? Again, this show has only come to you this week because of the generosity of these absolutely fantastic human beings, by which I'm blown away every single week, particularly when I see new people joining. Like we saw three new patrons this week, which I thought was
incredible stuff. They save us every week. They save us. They make it happen, especially during this very difficult lockdown. They need to go to www.interplanetary.org.uk. It's all there.
Yeah, you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, possibly not bother with Facebook, as previously discussed. And because the thing about Facebook, if I go, then I'll get sucked into the vortex.
Matt will start arguing with people again. What do you mean the Earth is flat?
Jamie.
Yeah.
What have you got planned for this weekend?
I'm very busy this weekend, more DIY, but very excitingly, Matt, I'm going to a drive-in movie theatre in Chichester, and I'm going to see Reservoir Dogs.
Whoa!
And it's great because it's Secret Cinema. Shout out to Secret Cinema. So they'll have actors walking around, in character from the film, and I'm sure some sets. And you get food delivered to your car.
Yeah, well, do you know what's amazing? I'm going to shout out to some of my students who, in live event management this week, they 11 weeks ago, we were thinking about what students could do, and they decided to have a drive-in cinema, which had a live band playing the soundtrack. So you would go to see, say, Bohemian Rhapsody, and you would have a Queen tribute act doing the soundtrack underneath, and you drive into that, and it would be a live gig with exactly the same thing.
That is excellent. What an idea. Amazing.
So they definitely got the zeitgeist just right. So good on them.
I think they did. What are you up to, Matt? What are you up to this weekend?
Collecting my rover, which I'm afraid has now died.
Oh, no.
No, yeah, that's it. It is unfixable.
Oh, no.
So I've got to pay to have my car scrapped. That's so annoying. So now I'm going to be looking for a new vehicle.
Are you going to treat yourself to a new rover, or are you going to get a Tesla?
I might get a van.
Yes.
Yeah, I might get a van, and then I can take my telescope up onto Exmoor.
Are you going to get like the big dog van from Dumb and Dumber?
Yeah, Winnebago type thing.
It's a shaggin' wagon. Well, have a good weekend, Matt. And listeners, have a great weekend. Look after yourself, wear a mask, wash your hands, and look up to the sky.
Yes, enjoy your newfound freedoms, but don't take them for granted just yet.
Yes.
Yes. Look after each other.
You sound like Jerry Springer. Take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.
That was good.
Jerry. All right. Good night, everyone.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.